Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think that's become the traditional greeting these days. Welcome to the Soufan Center. My name is Naureen Chowdhury Fink. I'm the Executive Director, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I know many of our guests are joining from the UN also, where there's a lot of negotiations going on. And for many of you whom this may be your first Soufan Center event, welcome and hope to greet you all in person sometime very soon. I'm really looking forward to what promises to be a very exciting discussion, no bias on my end, of course. And I'd like to just start with one housekeeping note. The briefing will be recorded, so the opening and closing remarks, the panelists' briefings and discussion will be recorded, but not the question and answer session. So the question and answers and the post-briefing discussion session will be strictly under the Chatham House rule. So with that clarified, let's get right to it. For about 2 decades, our attention has focused on the strategic communications of groups like Al-Qaida and ISIS and the narratives they've used to radicalize and mobilize supporters. The phenomenon is not itself new. Margaret Thatcher famously spoke of the terrorists' need for the oxygen of publicity. But we saw Al-Qaida and ISIS wield the media to recruit, finance, and terrorize on a whole new transnational level. They invested heavily in media and communications and recognized, in many ways that the important role of the media alongside battlefield operations. However, we're also now seeing the emergence of a violent far-right extremist movement that has spawned domestic terrorist groups in several countries and is increasingly transnational as well, with money, ideas, and people crossing borders to cooperate, collaborate, and inspire each other. While these two kinds of groups certainly differ in the specifics of their beliefs and organizational structures, there are also some similarities. There is a quest among both of them for a community premised on racial or religious purity, on the use of violence to achieve that end goal, on anti-government sentiment, and the espousal of misogynist, intolerant narratives that deny individuals human rights. States, communities, and international actors like the UN have been grappling with this for quite a number of years, and the critical question of how to counter terrorist narratives and incitement without compromising human rights and freedom of speech. In his recent report on the implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, Secretary General Antonio Guterres reminds us that member states have pledged to counter terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and quote, in the face of a growing threat from racially, ethnically, and ideologically motivated right-wing and supremacist groups that resort to terrorist tactics, it is critical that member states continue to strongly condemn acts of terrorism targeting individuals on the basis, or in the name of race, ethnicity, religion, or belief, end quote. But more than just condemn it, the UN also has the potential to work on issues like preventing terrorist financing, helping states to develop the legal and criminal justice framework to address these groups, sharing lessons learned from countries that have been grappling with this phenomenon already for many years, and providing capacity building assistance. This can all be critical in ensuring a role for the UN in addressing evolving terrorist threats and not just those that appeared 2 decades ago. With those few opening remarks, it is my great pleasure to turn the screen, I was going to say the floor or the mic, but to turn the screen over to our co-host today. We're very grateful to Germany, to Norway, Belgium, and Tunisia for their support of this event. And it is now my great pleasure to turn over the floor to Herr Bernhard Heinz from Germany. Herr Heinz, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear event partners, friends from the Soufan Center, thank you all for joining this webinar today, and thanks to Naureen for giving me the opportunity to provide some opening remarks for our discussion on countering terrorist narratives and strategic communications, comparing the violent far right with ISIL, Daesh, and Al-Qaida. Ladies and gentlemen, extreme political views continue to flourish, disseminated by means of ideological set pieces and radical narratives. These kinds of narratives are designed to transport values coupled with emotions. They provide a means of identification and offer definitions of socio-political problems. The entire extremist spectrum likes to employ anti-democratic and radicalizing narratives, as they can be used to spread a complex message through short and succinct phrases. Narratives such as those used by right-wing extremists in particular, therefore have the power to fuel exclusion and violence towards minorities. The rapid increase in attacks on refugee accommodation in Germany shows how successful such narratives can be, as does the emergence of groups that base their activity on these narratives. These include, for example, vigilantes such as the Gruppe Freital from the Dresden area, who carried out bomb attacks on refugee accommodation and attacks on supporters of refugees. But they also include the allegedly right-wing terrorist group Gruppe S, which, among other things, planned attacks on Muslims in mosques, and the trial against those members whose members opened in Germany only a short time ago. One area that has so far received little attention is the investigation of certain narratives of radical groups from different categories, which nonetheless follow similar patterns. The modern world, universalism, Jews, and feminism are subjects that right-wing extremists and extremist Islamists as well have in common when they develop their narratives. Within these areas, each radical group has its own narrative. Right-wing extremists, for example, see themselves as victims of organized state feminism, whereas extremist Islamists regard gender equality as the true oppression of women. What the narratives always have in common is their rejection and condemnation of all forms of progress and enlightenment. For us, governments, the international community, and civil society, including academia, anti-democratic and radicalizing narratives offer considerable scope to develop effective counter-narratives. And the development of these counter-narratives is absolutely crucial. Ladies and gentlemen, for extremists, narratives are the material out of which they form their worldview. The currently ongoing protests against government measures to curb the COVID-19 pandemic also illustrate, once again, how narratives are often far removed from rationality and logic. They encourage people to take on simplified and radical viewpoints and curtail the process of opinion forming. Those narratives therefore stand in opposition to a plural and diverse democracy. The purpose of today's event is to examine in more depth anti-democratic and radicalizing narratives that promote violent extremism and lead to terrorism. We will also have the opportunity to exchange views on successful countermeasures. I'm greatly looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Herr Heinz, thank you very much for that. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you for your support. Ms. Morkestol, Norway, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Naureen. I'll just get my video starting. So thank you very much, and distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, and everyone attending today. Let me first start by thanking especially the Soufan Center and the co-partners for organizing this very timely event. So I will concentrate my remarks on three aspects, a bit broader than Mr. Heinz perhaps, but I think we will get to the same main points in the discussions. So I will talk a little bit about the threat development as seen from Norway, how we deal with the challenges, and include some demanding aspects as input to the discussion, including some reflections on freedom of speech and some experiences that we have had in Norway. So first, let me just remind you that this year, it is 10 years since a right-wing extremist killed 77 people in Norway, mostly youth, at Utøya and in Oslo. Several people were also wounded. This February, the Norwegian Police Security Service arrested a 16-year-old charged with planning a terrorist attack motivated by Islamic extremism. So we have seen a negative development in the threat from terrorism from both right-wing and Islamic extremism in Norway. And during this last year, we are increasingly worried that the events in other countries, as well as actions on internet or elsewhere deemed insulting by Islamic extremists, are reducing the threshold for violence. The pandemic has a worsening effect on radicalization towards right-wing extremism through increased isolation, frustration, but also in the rise in hate speech and inspiration on online platforms. And those narratives online attract. And we see an increasing number of persons of concern who are very young. So the second aspect I would like to mention is how we approach this in Norway. The Norwegian approach against radicalization and violent extremism is directed against all forms of violent extremism in all its manifestations. So the overall framework is a whole of society approach with a focus on early prevention and cross-sectoral cooperation. As an example, the action plan against radicalization, the current one, involves 9 government ministries and several society actors from the civilian society, And we apply that same broad approach in our current effort to develop a national counterterrorism strategy. Although our strategic policies are directed at all forms of extremism, we continuously assess whether the measures are needed, whether there are new measures needed to address developing challenges. For example, that terrorist financing may differ between Islamic extremism and right-wing extremism. And the chosen government approach is also a strong message to the public and may be considered as a transparent form of strategic communication. The third aspect, we have identified some dilemmas and demanding aspects in need for careful consideration. And I believe these will benefit from a broad exchange of views, including this webinar, to share lessons and ideas. So the online challenge with the digital subcultures, hatred, conspiracy, acceleration theories, and the spread of violent material. This is not only a national issue, it requires a broader, more international lens, and it requires a strong involvement of private actors. Also, managing the line between illegal content online and freedom of speech requires careful deliberation. I will share some Norwegian lessons in this regard. In Norway, hate speech is prohibited and punishable by law. However, we need to make a distinction to protect the democratic political debate. So political statements are therefore normally protected by freedom of speech, even if it causes strong offense and upset. And this is an important point, but at times it is very challenging to communicate this strategically. So in conclusion, I reiterate that terrorist threats in Norway is of increasing concern, worsened also by the pandemic. And Norway has benefited a lot from a very broad approach against radicalization and all forms of violent extremism. And finally, the challenges keep changing. Hence, we need a broad international exchange of ideas to help us identify the best measures to face these threats. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your discussions today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Markestad, and thank you always for Norway's support on these topics and for your leadership in a lot of the work on preventing violent extremism at the UN. With that, I'm terribly pleased now to be able to be joined by three fantastic panelists to take us through some of these complex dynamics and questions that we've all tried to flag in some of the opening remarks. I have with us today Colin Clarke, who is a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center, Vidhya Ramalingam, who is the founder of Moonshot CVE, and Mattias Sundholm, who is with the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. I'll turn to the three of you in that order, if I may, to give about 8 minutes of remarks. They've all been forewarned that I may cough discreetly if we go too far over that time. But I think that we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So with that, Colin, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Naureen. Thanks to all my colleagues at the Soufan Center and all of our partners for this event, because this is a critically important subject. And it's one that I think we're a little bit behind the 8 ball on, if I'm being honest. That said, there's a lot of opportunities, and I look forward to the discussion, particularly on countering strategic narratives. So I'm going to give an overview of both Al-Qaida and the Islamic State, two groups I've been studying for many years, including looking very closely at the way they use narratives, the way that they use strategic communications, and how effective those have been. For Al-Qaida, I think there's 3 top-level takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. The first is that the text, "The Management of Savagery," looms quite large for this group. The second is that Al-Qaida really was one of the pioneers of targeting multiple audiences with their narratives, not only the Muslim world, but also the West. And these narratives were tailored. And then lastly, Al-Qaida is focused on policy change in many of its communications, which makes it, in my opinion, one of the more effective communicators of what terrorism is, propaganda of the deed. I think initially, while Al-Qaeda's narratives were quite sophisticated, both aesthetically and historically, over time, we noticed that its messages were becoming a bit wide-ranging and unfocused. I pinpoint this as the transition from bin Laden to Ayman al-Zawahiri. I think bin Laden had a real appreciation for and understanding of the way that narratives could shape Al-Qaeda's ideology, its brand, if you will, and wielded that quite effectively. The current leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is a bit long-winded and pedantic. The Management of Savagery in particular really urged Al-Qaeda followers to understand the strategies of the West, to exploit US and European vulnerabilities, and even to study the Arabic translation of Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Power. So there was some real depth here to what Al-Qaeda was speaking about to its followers. It was really quite adept at addressing myriad issues that many in the Arab and Muslim worlds were passionate about. So the liberation of Palestine, US occupation of Iraq, the corruption of apostate regimes in the region, right? The so-called near enemy in the Middle East and South Asia. But above all, Al-Qaeda always portrayed itself, and quite successfully at times, as the defender and the vanguard of Muslims everywhere, the so-called Ummah. And the core narrative of Al-Qaeda's messaging was that it was individual jihad, the personal responsibility of individuals, fused with this collective revenge against the West and this encroachment on Muslim lands. To close on Al-Qaeda, I'd say, again, the narratives really drove toward this idea of changing policy. That was a constant theme that came up in messaging, whether it was directed at the United States or in the aftermath of the Madrid attacks at the Spanish government. I mean, there was a real, quite sophisticated understanding of the way that policy changes could work in democratically elected societies, right? That people could vote if they were unhappy with policies or felt threatened and cajoled and coerced in this case. For the Islamic State, the top 3 takeaways I'd like to leave you with are, 1, their narratives were not nearly as narrowly focused as Western media portrayed. In fact, they were quite broad in many ways. Second, even as ISIS was ideologically quite rigid, their narratives had some built-in flexibility because in many ways, the Islamic State was planning for what happened next, the phase that we're in now, the destruction of the caliphate. And because of that, a lot of ISIS strategic communications was laying the groundwork and was doing so subtly, preparing followers and potential supporters for what would inevitably happen, which is the destruction of the caliphate in many ways. ISIS propaganda focused on the restoration of the caliphate and constantly reemphasized that this was the group that made it happen, right? We saw with 40,000 foreign fighters from over 110 countries flocking to the caliphate, success is sexy, and stacking wins, right, is what drove so many recruits to the caliphate. And they were quite aware of that. That was built into part of the narrative. The group's slogan, remaining and expanding, right? Rather than living in this apostate regime in the Middle East or morally bankrupt societies in the West, come and join this ideal Islamic community. And that's what I mean by, if you were to turn on the nightly news in the United States, excuse me, you'd see a focus on the beheadings, on the gore, right, the violence. But ISIS narratives were a lot more than that, particularly to those that were paying close attention. I think what I'd like to close with is what happens now, right? Now that the physical caliphate has been destroyed, can ISIS narratives still be effective? Can they still draw the attention and the support that its previous narratives have? And I wrote about this a couple of years ago with Hararo Ingram, and we called it the ISIS nostalgia narrative. And this was the Islamic State essentially saying, look, it doesn't matter that the caliphate's been destroyed. What matters is that we created it in the first place. And this is an achievement that is historic in many ways. It gives people hope. It also leads followers and supporters to believe that it's in the realm of the possible and that this could be recreated once again. So I think as I speak with policymakers and folks from the intelligence community in Europe and elsewhere, that's on everyone's mind. Could this happen again? Could we see a similar mobilization of foreign fighters? And the really important question to follow up on is, if so, where? Where might that take place? And I think there are any number of places that look to be viable candidates these days, unfortunately. One would be in sub-Saharan Africa, as we see a real rejuvenation of jihadi groups, including groups linked to both Al-Qaida and the Islamic State. But also, I think, I'm looking quite closely now at South Asia, with the US troop withdrawal, with the rest of the ISAF and NATO troops withdrawing. Jihadi groups sense a real opportunity and may very well look to once again mobilize foreign fighters to converge on a part of the world that they see ripe for the taking. And so I think knowing what we know about ISIS strategic narratives and strategic communication, as well as what Al-Qaeda has done in the past, I'll be looking quite closely to see how they, dip into their playbook, so to speak, and resurrect some of the themes that we know they're likely to use to prepare for what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. I think for me also two important points you highlighted, which we do sometimes forget in the discussion on policy and practice. And I think one you've really stressed is the propaganda of the deed. When we're talking about narratives of terrorist groups, I think we do sometimes too often hear about online narratives or kind of the manufactured rhetoric that they use. But I think you've, very much reminded us that part of their strategic communications was their actions. So the establishment of the caliphate, the 9/11 attacks, the destruction of Palmyra, these all sent a very clear message about dominance and control. And as you say, however fleeting, and laying the groundwork for what comes next. But also you've reminded us that, online activity has these offline consequences, that the real action of terrorism in many ways, right, is offline. And so when we think about that online-offline relationship, we need to remember that there is a connection, and then that there are these real world consequences and actions that then translate to people's experiences online. But that's my segue into turning to Vidhya. Colin, you've talked a lot about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and then we have been talking today also about the violent far-right movement and the emerging threat that they pose. So with that, Vidhya, I turn to you for some of your thoughts on that.
Thanks so much, Naureen, and thank you to the Soufan Center and Germany, Belgium, Norway, and Tunisia for the invitation to join you all today. My name is Vidhya Ramalingam. I am co-founder of Moonshot, and we're an organization based both in London and Washington, D.C. that works with both governments, tech companies, and also the international community to respond to violent extremism and a range of other online harms. And I thought as we're gathered today with such an international crowd, I thought I'd just start with a personal reflection. Some of you might know this subject is personal for me. About 12 years ago, I moved to Sweden and set out on a mission to meet with white nationalists. And at the time, I simply wanted to understand what motivated people to join those groups and what would keep them in the movements. And I spent 2 years at the time doing life history interviews, embedding myself with these movements, trying to understand what might get people out. And then when the July 22nd attacks happened in Norway, I spent 3 years running the EU's first intergovernmental initiative on right-wing extremism, and that was headed by the Nordic governments. It spanned 10 countries at the time, and it was a lot of hard work to build up international collaboration. Looking back now, our goals for international cooperation on right-wing extremism after the 2011 attacks seem so modest in retrospect. Today, we are living through a unique moment as a global community. Right-wing extremist movements have always thrived on moments of crisis, and sometimes those crises happen at the national level. We are now in the midst of multiple concurrent crises happening on a global level. And crises are moments where we typically see right-wing extremist actors grasping to turn fear and anxiety in society into an opportunity for them to grow. And so there's been a few dangerous strategic communications tactics that we've seen from these groups on a global level over the last year and a half in particular. Right-wing extremists have deliberately adapted their narratives and propagated conspiracy theories based on these current affairs, based on what we're living through today. We've witnessed a clear cycle in the distribution of conspiracy theories. We tend to see conspiracy theory narratives deliberately seeded on fringe platforms where right-wing extremists are clustered, where there's little to no moderation. And by design, they select those narratives in order to reflect the news media cycle. So they're very reactive, reacting to what they're seeing in the news around them. And they do that really deliberately to attract attention. They then start pushing those narratives into the mainstream, and we've seen strategizing taking place on the fringe platforms for them to decide how best to push their narratives into the mainstream. And then as the media begins to cover those narratives, we tend to see then the tech companies be reactive and crack down. And once again, these narratives and the groups are forced back to the fringe platforms. So it's a bit of a cycle that we've now seen repeatedly over the last year and a half. But we've also, as part of this strategy, we've seen what is a really dangerous blending and metastasization of various ideologies and movements, which were once previously distinct. So everything from the more traditional white supremacist and neo-Nazi narratives, all the way through to anti-vaccination conspiracies that have been built up around the pandemic. And the merging and mixing of these movements and ideologies has made it more challenging for us to silo audiences and run targeted prevention initiatives. In addition to their deliberate exploitation of the current crises that we're living through, we're also in a heightened state of use of the internet more broadly. And so when the pandemic began last spring, we tracked a 37% increase nationwide across the United States in attempts to access white supremacist content on search engines. We saw something very similar in other countries around the world. New Zealand last spring, we saw a nationwide increase of 44%. Australia, we saw a nationwide increase of 68% in the spring, again, in attempts to access white supremacy content. Today, over 1 year on from the start of the pandemic, in the United States, so I mentioned that number last spring was 37% increase. Today, we're looking at 140% higher engagement with white supremacist content than we saw pre-pandemic on search engines. So all of that to say, throughout this year plus, for the last year and a half or so, we've been in a state of heightened extremist activity online. So I want to tell you a bit about what we're finding in our efforts to deliver some counter-narrative and strategic communications efforts to reach these kinds of audiences globally. Now, a general finding of moonshots over the past several years across the spectrum, we tend to find that extremist audiences are most receptive to what I'd call non-ideological interventions. as compared to explicit counter-narratives, so content which tries to undermine the ideology. 3 years ago in the US, we ran tests of this and we found that white supremacists were 48% more likely to engage with self-help and essentially mental health and self-help content as compared to the general public. And this also holds across the ideological spectrum. If we look at Islamist extremist audiences, 3 years ago, we also tested this with Islamist extremist audiences globally. And in our test, they were 47% more likely to engage with self-help content and mental health-oriented content than the general public. Earlier this year, we released some new data showing from our tests in Indonesia that audiences engaging with violent groups online were 128% more likely to engage with psychosocial support content as compared to traditional ideological counter content. And specifically, that's specifically the case when our messaging referenced loneliness and the kind of emotions of feeling lonely. So this trend holds in nearly every geography we try it. So in the United States in particular, I want to give you a couple more recent examples. Since September of last year, as the context became more polarized, especially in the run-up to the US election, and as we saw heightened mobilization by right-wing extremists, we ran what I'm calling crisis campaigns to reach far-right audiences with non-ideological, essentially de-escalation messaging. So we were not trying to get in ideological debates with them. This was messaging really aiming to de-escalate someone from taking violent action. So what did we find? We found that the most engaging message we ran to reach right-wing extremists began with the statement, "Anger and grief can be isolating." So on average, our audiences were 17% more likely to click on that message than any of the others that we tested. Armed group audiences in particular engaged most with messages that I'd broadly call calm as the theme. It's about taking someone and calming them down. Again, de-escalation. One popular ad we ran said, "Don't do something you'll regret. Self-control is key," and it offered mindfulness exercises to de-escalate someone from anger. Armed groups also engaged most with what I'd call, so a set of messaging that I'd call positive American identity messages. So again, not trying to get into ideological debates about far-right ideology, but instead it was messaging saying, when you make yourself better, you make America better, learn how. And it offered information about essentially positive acts of patriotism. So patriotism not rooted in violence or destruction, but rooted instead in community. And interestingly, QAnon audiences in particular, so and especially in that intersection between QAnon and the far right, they engaged most with what I call empathy anger ads. So ads that said, "Are you feeling angry? You're not alone. Learn how to escape the anger and move forward." Most importantly, we worked not only to provide some digital content, but to also offer a resource where those audience groups could access services. So we set up a 24/7 crisis messaging support line where users can text in and speak to a counselor over text message at any time of the day to access immediate support. We had this running during the January 6th insurrection in the US. We offered that crisis counseling service to more than 270,000 high-risk internet users during the January 6th DC violence. We've had over 70,000 engagements with that campaign, and for users who have completed counseling sessions, we've even seen some of those users return to the service for repeat counseling. All of this to say, it is really tempting in the delivery of strategic communications and counter-narrative campaigns to reach far-right audiences and Islamist extremist audiences to focus. It's really tempting for us to focus on ideological counter-narratives. Now, there is mounting evidence and growing evidence to show that in delivering these kinds of campaigns to reach those truly at risk, that non-ideological psychosocial interventions show a lot of promise and may be a more effective way of sustaining engagement. Now, that isn't to say we should stop delivering ideological counter-narratives. It's just about testing and finding the exact audiences that are going to be most receptive to that messaging. Just an interesting anecdote in the US, users who were looking to access information about the KKK and about joining the KKK, they actually didn't prefer the emotional appeal ads. They actually preferred the ideological counter-narrative ads. And on the contrary, users that were looking for information about joining armed groups and conspiracy theories, like the Boogaloo movement, they engaged more with ads which were about that emotional response. So we do need to continue testing this. And my main message here is let's ensure we're not guiding our counter-narrative or strategic messaging campaigns based on assumptions. There are some opportunities here for us to meaningfully respond. We just need to get the messaging right. And it's really important that as much as possible, we run experiments with different types of audiences online to continue to build the evidence base. Thank you, Naureen.
Thanks so much, Vidhya. If I had my way, I'd let each of you speak for an hour and spend the whole day doing this and forget that it's actually my job. But this was really fascinating. And I think you've really thrown up some really surprising numbers. I think that 140% increase particularly is a really important, I was going to say red flag, but you know, and I think you've also reminded us of the sort of cognitive opening en masse that these crises have created, and that, you know, while we think about counter narratives, we also need to think about how we actually address these crises that create the enabling environment, whether it's a pandemic, you know, certainly now in some contexts it's violent conflict. So a reminder that we need to think about counter narratives, but we also need to think about addressing the kind of crises environment that allow them to flourish. And I think you've also reminded us of, I think what FBI Director Ray also called a salad bar of ideologies, right? This mishmash, which we've also written about at TSC, which is making it harder to think about what groups we're actually, you know, working on or with or against, you know. So thank you for that. I think it's just made the picture more complicated, but that's what we're here to do, because unless we get a good picture, we're not going to fix it. Not sure if we ever can, but we'll try. And with that, I will turn to Mattias, who's going to solve all of it in the next 8 minutes and give us all the answers. But also very keen to hear your thoughts on how international organizations and the UN and others have been working on these issues, and how you balance that careful question of human rights. But Mattias, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Naureen, and good morning, afternoon, everybody, and a big thank you on behalf of CTED to the Soufan Center, of course, to Naureen, my fellow panelists, as well as all the member states participating today. First off, just in terms of strategic comms and terrorist or violent extremist narratives more broadly, I just wanted to reiterate or stress what I think has already been touched upon, which is that the current pandemic has reinforced existing trends rather than created new ones. We know that already before this pandemic, terrorists, violent extremists were opportunistic, adapting to new circumstances, taking advantage of changing realities, both online and on the ground. And these seems to continue as they keep exploiting the vulnerabilities, the loneliness, as mentioned by Vidhya, for example, frustration, depression, people all over the world, including children and youth, as they are spending more time online. My second initial point is, if there ever was a line between the narratives of terrorists or violent extremists on the one hand and misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories on the other, this has become increasingly blurred in the last year, which in turn has made the internet and social media even more of a battleground for freedom of expression and opinion. And efforts to strike a balance has become increasingly challenging. And this goes to the point that you, Naureen, just made, which is that, you know, it's getting increasingly complex, I think. In terms of narratives promoted by the various groups, my fellow co-panelists have already mentioned a few of these. I think it's interesting to note some of the paradoxes that have appeared in light of the pandemic. For example, some Islamist jihadist groups have been referring to the virus as a product of the West, while others claim it's a soldier of God or the forerunner of the apocalypse. Another ironic example was when ISIL rebutted some of the conspiracy theories circulating online, like when they stated that the pandemic was not in fact caused by the US, but is part of a divine plan. Extreme right-wing groups, on the other hand, have co-opted claims that link 5G with the spread of the pandemic, while others have claimed that vaccination programs are thinly veiled attempts to either control or kill parts of the population, using those to escalate discord and promote disharmony in society as a means to bring down the system. And again, the multiplicity of conspiracy theories can act as a unifying and mobilizing force for groups or individuals that seek to incite hate or violence. And conspiracy theories can then act as radicalization multipliers and potentially increase the likelihood that individuals will engage in offline or real violence. So I think there's an urgent and ongoing need to address growing misinformation and conspiracy theories surrounding both the pandemic and vaccinations, as member states are beginning to implement vaccination programs in an effort to bring the virus under control. Now at the UN level and on the UN side, bear with me, this is a very long name, but the UN Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, it's a mouthful. It's a working group on PCV, which basically gathers a number of UN entities, including CTED, that are involved in CVE work or PCV work. We initiated together an 18-month project on countering terrorist narratives that recently concluded. And the expert consultant who led this work, he was instructed to let his work be informed in particular by UN Security Council Resolution 2354 from 2017 that some of you might be familiar with. And that focuses on countering terrorist narratives as well as amplifying positive and credible alternatives to narratives promoted by VE, violent extremists. He was also instructed to let Resolution 1624 from 2005 guide his work, which, as a reminder, calls on all states to adopt measures necessary to prohibit incitement to terrorist action or violence. In terms of recommendations stemming from this project, one of the main ones is to develop more extensive partnerships. And those partnerships would ideally take place between member states, NGOs, community level organizations, to facilitate message distribution by trusted sources. And I think this is important to stress that it's by trusted sources. Another couple of recommendations I'd like to mention from this, from the concluding findings of the study include the development and use of clearinghouses. So basically clearinghouses that connect subject matter experts with program personnel. In particular, subject matter experts with knowledge in relation both to comms, to communication science and psychology. And one missing piece, and I think this goes to perhaps both Vidhya's and others' points, which is strong recommendations to emphasize systematic monitoring and evaluation practices, which are often lacking, but if properly used, could inform systematic learning in this field going forward. Now, my second part of my brief remarks is I'd like to just focus on the implications for human rights and by extension how this could impact our efforts to counter terrorist and VE narratives. In response to various waves of COVID-19 infections, many states have reinstated social restrictions and emergency powers that in many cases were introduced in the initial months of the pandemic, including measures that limit fundamental freedoms of association, peaceful assembly and expression, and therefore cause for concern that the virus is being used as a pretext to curtail civil liberties. Now, whether temporary or long-term emergency measures that limit human rights has the potential to increase underlying grievances that can further contribute to radicalization to terrorism, and therefore obviously would have an impact on narratives and counter-narrative efforts. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in June last year acknowledged the need to restrict harmful misinformation or disinformation or any incitement of hatred towards minority groups to protect public health, but urged that this should not result in purposeful or unintentional censorship. Measures that restrict the right to freedom of expression should adhere to the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality. They should serve as a legitimate, a legitimate objective and should also represent the least intrusive approach required to achieve that result. In this context, I would just like I would like us to, for 1 second, stop and think about one of the more popular types of interventions that have been employed by both online platforms and governments in recent years, and that is the removal of content or denial of access. Because rather than combating the ideologies that drive the messages vulnerable individuals might encounter, a strategy of content removal or denial of access is intended to remove the possibility that these individuals will encounter messages that could or might radicalize them towards violence altogether. And what I think is important to keep in mind is that there are still no data that we have seen linked to the denial or removal of terrorist or VE content on its effectiveness in terms of diminishing the appeal of this violent extremist ideologies. Because frankly, or simply denial or removal of content does not challenge any of these ideologies, they seek to circumvent them altogether. So I think it's just important to flag this, as sometimes we hear removal of content or counter messaging being talked about as perfect substitutes. Very lastly, some member states have taken action to counter the rise of conspiracy theories and mis or disinformation and their exploitation by extreme right-wing and other actors. In certain countries, however, like the US, for example, restricting incitement of hatred might prove very difficult, especially if it is coming from a group that has not been designated as a terrorist organization. And so therefore, in practice, much of the responsibility for countering online disinformation has fallen to the private sector, with Facebook, for example, banning ads that attempt to exploit the crisis using internal fact checks to add labels to misinformation about COVID-19, for example, or Twitter extending its definition of harm to include the spreading of unverified claims that incite people to action and cause widespread panic. In addition, Twitter has published in-depth guidance on how to detect a bot, as well as information on platform manipulation, while the research community has highlighted the importance of how we can better distinguish real from fake. But I think my time is up, so I will stop here, and we'll be happy to take questions and discuss more shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mattias. I didn't have to do the discreet cough. You knew it was coming. Really appreciate it. And I think you've really flagged a couple of really important reminders about ensuring that, the very measures that we're taking to ensure that terrorist groups can't, perpetrate harm through their narratives are not in themselves harmful. And I think we'll come back to that in the discussion session. And I think that's a really critical point, as is all the experience in making sure that lessons learned from around the world in countering narratives are actually in some place collated and can inform future activities. So that's a little sneak preview to the question I'm probably going to ask shortly. And at this point, I'd like to turn over to the representatives of Belgium, that'll be Mr. Carl Dane, and Tunisia, that'll be Ms. Naureen El Mansouri, for about a couple of minutes of closing remarks, and then I'll come in right at the end after them. So thank you again, Colin, Mattias, Vidhya, and Carl Dane and Belgium. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Naureen, distinguished colleagues. First of all, let me thank the eminent panelists for their interventions and the Soufan Center for organizing this important event. Belgium is pleased to co-host this event together with Germany, Norway, and Tunisia. In my concluding remarks, I would like to say a few words about conspiracy theories as they found and fuel both Al-Qaida, Daesh, and far-right propaganda. I'd like to briefly address the motivations behind them, the challenges they pose, and the possible responses. Conspiracy thinking, as we heard today, refers to the questioning of factual elements whereby the adherents appeal to occult causes to explain a set of phenomena. It gives alternative explanations to official narratives that are not accepted. The motivations to adhere to such theories are multiple and can be epistemic, existential, or social. Epistemic to the extent that their adherence stems from a need for clear and unequivocal explanations. Existential, as there is a desire to take back control of one's life. Social, as there is a need for belonging to a group and identity. Literature and prevention projects show that these motivations often also constitute the root causes to enter into a process of radicalization, irrespective of form or ideology. Let me now dwell on the challenges posed by these conspiracy theories. CUTA, the Belgian Central Unit for Threat Analysis, examines the influence of conspiracy theories on individuals or groups likely to commit extremist and/or terrorist acts. In addition to the far right or far left and Islamist narratives, CUTA notices the emergence of protest movements such as violent demonstration against COVID measures or threat against virologists, which have no political or ideological affiliation but are directed against measures taken by the government. Now, how can we best deal with these movements? In itself, dissent is part of life in a democracy. However, these protest movements constitute an important reservoir in which existing classical extremist ideologies now draw. In times of crisis and uncertainty, people become more receptive to conspiracies, theories, fake news, and misinformation. To curb the development and adherence of these conspiracy theories, let me mention a few possible responses. The importance of clear communication from the authorities, including in the social media. The removal of hateful and extremist terrorist content online while respecting fundamental freedoms. But I take due note of Mattias' comments on this matter. We have also the importance of counter narratives that offer an alternative to extremist jihadist propaganda, but I'd also take due note of the importance of non-ideological psychosocial intervention as stated by Vidhya. To conclude, what is clear from today's discussion is that we need to address these challenges together, and that is why international exchanges and cooperation is that important. I thank you very much.
Carl, thank you very much for your statement, and we greatly appreciate Belgium's support also for this initiative and these conversations. Tunisia, Ms. Naureen El-Mansouri, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Naureen. Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I wish to thank the Soufan Center for hosting this very interesting webinar and thank the panelists for their very insightful remarks. Indeed, the discussion revealed clearly that the challenges posed by extreme right-wing terrorism, or also called ethnically, religiously, and ideologically motivated terrorism, are increasing and deeply worrying. Even though states use different terminologies to describe this phenomena, there is a growing consensus as to the need for it to be addressed urgently and multilaterally. We have seen worrying growth in the volume and level of threat posed by extreme right-wing terrorism that is becoming increasingly transnational in terms of financing, communication, recruitment, and radicalization. The COVID-19 pandemic and the availability of information and communication technologies have played a catalyzing role in broadening this phenomenon into global networks. In this regard, I wish to briefly highlight three aspects. First, seemingly this form of extremism is feeding from supremacist and xenophobic ideas, including a sort of clash of civilizations that mobilizes the proponents of these ideologies against the spread of different religious or racial demographics in the West, that is portrayed through the simplistic lens of a resistance against ISIL and Al-Qaida ideologies. However, the right-wing extremism is at the same time mimicking in many ways the tactics, propaganda, and training materials of ISIL and Al-Qaida. They are benefiting from each other's narratives and lessons learned. This means that we also have an opportunity to exploit our own national and international lessons learned, particularly in the last 2 decades, to counter terrorism and to apply these best practices when applicable in the prevention and combat against right-wing terrorism. It is critical that our responses be informed both by the unique characteristics of extreme right-wing terrorism and by the lessons that we have learned from fighting different forms of terrorism. Second, as other speakers have mentioned, violent extremism and terrorism thrive in the times of crisis. This requires a focus on prevention efforts and on tackling different underlying drivers. In doing so, our response efforts have to be rooted in a human rights-based approach that seeks to address the drivers of radicalization to terrorism by preventing and preserving and respecting human rights both online and offline, particularly, as the panelists have mentioned, freedom of expression and opinion, as well as freedom of religion and belief. It is very important to rely on a whole of government and whole of society approach that promotes the participation of different stakeholders, including civil society and the private sector, especially internet service providers and social media companies, as has been mentioned, as well as a special focus on the engagement of women and youth. And finally, this discussion is very timely as we are in the process of reviewing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. We believe that the issue has to be addressed through a multilateral lens, both in the Security Council through the Counterterrorism Committee, as well as the interesting idea that has been mentioned about perhaps the listing or the designation through other committees, and the General Assembly as well. And we are seeking, along with a broad range of member states, to advance strong language on it, including by defining the most adequate terminology and strategies for prevention and eradication of this phenomena. I will stop here and thank you once again for the interesting exchange of views today, and I look forward to continuing the discussion in the future.
Thank you very much, Naureen, and to all our co-hosts today for supporting this event, and also very much to all our guests who've joined us and shared some really fascinating questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully, like I said, we will be continuing this discussion. It's impossible for me to sum up what we've discussed here today. I think that the presentations and the answers speak for themselves, but I would like to share 3 parting thoughts for everyone to take into account. I think the first one is that we consistently underestimate the propaganda of the deed. when violent groups do something or say they want to do something, we should take it seriously, because that is how they are communicating not only their intention, but their power and their strategic objectives. So to take acts of violence seriously, to take the intention to perpetrate acts of violence seriously, and to remember that the actions are part of the strategic communications and narrative. I think the second point for me that everyone highlighted is that the enabling environment is really critical, whether it is the fact that multiple crises create the enabling environment, or that such rhetoric is either normalized or legitimized by communities, by cultural, faith, political leaders, and that it becomes acceptable to move out of an extremist fringe into a mainstream with these kinds of extremist narratives and create an environment where violent groups can then prosper. And then I think the third and critical point in all of this is that human rights isn't just a box ticking exercise. We know that violations of human rights are an important mobilizing and recruiting narrative for extremist groups. We know that for many people, negative experiences with the state or human rights violations have been an important part of the growing distrust and distance between state and citizen, and that effectively integrating human rights into counterterrorism measures is sometimes itself that important counter or alternative narrative that we have at our disposal to, walk the walk. And when we talk the talk about importance of human rights, we know that extremist groups are watching and using our own actions sometimes against us. So human rights is a critical component, not a box ticking exercise. With that, I'd like to thank all of you. Our work on this topic is at www.thesoufancenter.org. The Mapping Insecurity Project also brings together all our work on right-wing white supremacist extremism. And I know that Vidhya's work, Colin's work, CTED's work is quite active, available online. So I encourage you to find them on Twitter and on the internet. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today. Bye.